Hello and welcome to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. In this episode, my guest and I discuss not a single politician, but a political party. This is a party that has been making headlines across Europe of late, as they now seem to be pulling the strings in the Swedish government, despite not actually having any ministers. The Sweden Democrats are the first far-right party in Sweden's parliament. Unlike UKIP, which was a populist party but not initially far-right, as it split off from the Conservatives, the Sweden Democrats' origins in fascism and pre-fascist far-right Swedish political thinking is well documented. First entering parliament in 2010, Sweden Democrats, led by the bespectacled Jimmie Akesson, now support a right-wing government propelled to power after many years of riots and shootings in the country's cities. The party has increased its vote share at every election since the 1990s, something which has coincided, and in part been caused by, an increase in mass immigration, especially Islamic immigration. There's no doubt that Sweden is changing fast. The more I read about the country, the less I'm sure I understand what it's moving away from and what it's changing into. It's often associated with socialism or social democracy, but it has been consolidating its welfare state for decades. Its still comprehensive welfare model is based on high levels of trust and togetherness, but Swedes are also known for a highly individualistic approach to life. It's known in many quarters as a liberal bastion, but now has a far-right party effectively in its government. The Sweden that emerges from the conversation today is one of political extremism and anxiety. Where does this leave Sweden's reputation for tolerance and liberalism? Was this an illusion? Did it ever exist in the first place? This is the central theme of today's podcast. My guest today is the journalist Anders Lindberg, who is political editor-in-chief of the Swedish newspaper Aftonbladet, or evening paper. As well as the Sweden Democrats, we discuss Sweden's approach to handling the 2015 migrant crisis, the country's welfare model, and whether Sweden will see a liberal approach to immigration again. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce the Sweden Democrats. Hi Anders, how are you?
I'm just fine.
Anders, we're talking about the Sweden Democrats today. They are, as of the election that happened in September, the second largest party in Sweden's parliament. Sweden is an old democracy, and their history has been defined by one party, really, principally by the Social Democrats. They have been the largest party in the Swedish parliament for every election, I think, since World War I. Why have they been so dominant? What do they stand for?
I think the Social Democrats of Sweden is, you can say it's an offshoot of the European social democracy, very much inspired in the beginning of the 20th century by the German social democracy and by the Danish social democracy. And it's a combination between, I believe in equality, I believe in the welfare state, with the belief in growth, economic development, and a kind of policy that includes all of Sweden, which basically mean that in Swedish psyche or Swedish political psychology, the Social Democrats for many years were synonymous with development, with progress for people. So that meant that the Social Democrats actually were in government constantly from 1932 to 1976, which more or less formed the modern Swedish welfare state and modern Sweden. So I think that this is on one side a kind of a psychological dominance, one side of course electoral. This was the working class party, and as working class you had the majority in most elections. After 1976 we have changed government every 8 or 12 or 4 years until now. But you can say that the psychology from the Social Democrats is in many ways still defining Swedish identity.
Thank you. If we turn to the Sweden Democrats, then that's the party that we're focusing on today, fairly similar name to the Social Democrats, the party we've just been talking about confusingly. The Sweden Democrats were formed in 1988. What were the circumstances of their formation? And I suppose something else that's important to work out is why were they formed at this particular time in the 1980s?
You can say that it's different reasons for both your questions, and in a way you can't really say that they have started at one particular point in time in that way. The party formally was founded in 1988, but the party were founded on after a number of rather turbulent years when different far-right groups sort of regrouped, changed their names, changed their identity, formed different parties. They also managed to get local far-right parties to go into this kind of frame that the Sweden Democrats were. And that was also a process that continued after the formation of the Sweden Democrats, and it was there before the formation of the Sweden Democrats. But if you look at kind of the framework, the Sweden Democrats is the child of two different groups. One is the Nordiska Rikspartiet, the Nordic, you can say, Reich Party or National Party, which is a Nazi outfit, which roots go back all the way to the Nazi movement during the Second World War. The other movement was the new fascist movement in Sweden, which roots is going back before the Second World War. And these two movements had a lot of activists that together formed a grouping called Keep Sweden Swedish. And from that grouping, the Sweden Democrats were formed. And it's quite important because these two different roots, the neo-fascism in Sweden, is going back to an older fascist story. It's connected with Karl XII, the king that was attacked by Russia and then lost the Swedish Empire in the Battle of Poltava in 1709. He died the 30th of November. And 30th of November is the kind of holy day for the Swedish far right. And that is connected to an older tradition than actually a 19th century tradition. So this is one fascist root which goes back historically much longer in time than the Second World War. The Nordiska Rikspartiet was a formation of people that basically thought that Hitler was a good idea. And they kept this kind of racial ideology, which also the German Nazi movement had. So when you took these two traditions and formed the Sweden Democrats, you actually formed, in a way, a new phenomena that we have never had a successful far-right party before, but in a way also a very old roots within the Swedish society. So this was not something that came sort of from abroad, even if parts of this came from abroad. It also came within the Swedish society. One particular person, which is very much discussed here in Sweden, is Gustav Ekström. Gustav Ekström was active in these kind of pre-Second World War Nazi and fascist movements in Sweden. He joined Waffen-SS and he became Rottenführer in Waffen-SS, which is a lower officer grade. And during the war, he was actually in the SS Hauptamt in Berlin. And after the war, he fled to Sweden. He was never prosecuted or anything. He fled to Sweden. And he was one of the founders of the Sweden Democrats. So there is a direct link from the Sweden Democrats of today to the Third Reich. But this kind of direct link to Nazi movements is quite unique among parties in Europe. You see the same in a way with Jobbik and their traditions going back to, in Hungary, going back to the previous Arrow Cross movement. You see this in some fascist movements. You see the Brothers of Italy is using much iconography of Mussolini and so on. But it's a rare example to have a Nazi movement in the way that the Sweden Democrats have.
To set a bit more context, if we look at the 1990s, the 90s was an interesting decade in Sweden's history. And from what I've read, it was defined at least in part by a severe financial crisis, a debt crisis that happened in the early 90s. It's quite interesting because in the UK, it's often said that we're a country that usually votes Conservative and then votes Labour occasionally when we're tired of the Conservatives. Sweden seems to an outsider like the other way around. You usually vote for the centre-left option, and then occasionally you vote otherwise, you vote for the right wing. So the country's kind of instinctively centre-left, not centre-right. How much did the debt crisis and the fiscal sort of consolidation that you went through in the 90s affect the Swedish welfare model? To what extent has it put the centre-left consensus in your country under strain?
The 90s affected the Swedish welfare models quite a lot. But if I'm allowed to disagree with you on a point, I would say that you can't really say that Sweden today is an inherently left-of-centre country. Sweden is a country which changes quite rapidly, and we have this kind of psychological effect in Sweden that very often everyone has the same opinion until everyone changes opinion. If you look at the NATO process, for example, you see that everyone is basically against NATO. You have 20-30% in favor, and then whoops, everyone swings, and 85% of the parliament wants to join NATO. And you have this very much of an effect in Swedish society as a whole. So we look like a kind of country of equality, and we're quite boring, and we are IKEA and so on. But we're actually a country of political extremes. And we've always been that. The Social Democrat, to have one party ruling the country for 44 years is quite extreme in European history. If you look at the 90s, what happened in the 90s was, or if you go back earlier, what happened in the 70s and beginning of the 80s, the oil crisis tremendously changed the Swedish welfare state. This image of a from cradle to grave welfare state that took care of you basically died in the 70s and 80s because it wasn't financed. You didn't have money for it. You had stagflation, which basically meant that you had to decrease the Swedish welfare state, which you did during the 80s. What happened in the 90s, and what was the real disaster in the 90s, was that the economy went completely bust. It wasn't just a debt crisis, it was an unemployment crisis. We had the lending rate. It was set to 500%. So it completely destroyed very much of Swedish economy in a few years. All of that then had to be adjusted in terms of the welfare payments. So basically during the 90s, you decreased spending on healthcare, on schools, on elderly care, on childcare, on social security system, on defense, which is a big problem at the moment, and so on. So you really changed to a smaller costume. But the funny thing with the Sweden Democrats was they didn't had any political power during that period. The same parties that sort of went into the 90s, went into this complete disaster, it's basically the same parties that still are around.
It might be a good time to bring in the single person I imagine we're going to talk about most today, which is Jimmie Akesson, who's still the leader of the Sweden Democrats. He has been since 2005. How much, it's often, I've read that the Sweden Democrats sort of moderated their views in the 1990s and 2000s. Indeed, I don't think, correct me on this if I'm wrong, I think Akesson actually was a member of the Moderate Party, which is the centre-right party, and then became a member of the Sweden Democrats later. How much did the Sweden Democrats moderate their views in the 90s and 2000s?
It's been sort of periods. If you look at the beginning of the Sweden Democrats in the 80s, they were more or less a Nazi outfit. If you read their earlier programs, if you look at the propaganda they were giving out, if you look at the kind of stickers and so on, it was this kind of Viking mythology, clearly Nazi in its origin. They were against foreign adoptions, for example. They wanted everyone that came here after 1974 to go back to their home countries, as they said, which was a substantial part of the population. It was a clear racist and Nazi outfit, basically. What happened during the 90s was that they tried to sort of modify the how people looked at this. They tried to sort of change the surface. And they tried to change from more of a racially sort of defined concept of being Swedish to more of a cultural concept or an identity concept. They hate it when you call them identitarians because they don't accept that role, but what they actually did is creating this kind of culture racism. So it's still they call it open Swedishness, which basically means that if you think you're Swedish and everyone else thinks you're Swedish, then you're Swedish. Which basically comes down to, if the Sweden Democrats think you're Swedish, you're Swedish. And that is in a way, they try to express this kind of open Swedishness with this, but what they're actually saying is that it's a very narrow Swedish ethnicity. And the thing is that when they said from the start that they're an interest party for Swedes, they actually define themselves against all other parties. So even if they sort of take away the open racism, what they do is create a new kind of racism, which is today also very obvious in their politics. When they speak about Islam, for example, they openly say, the head of the judicial committee in the parliament openly said that Christianity is over Islam. So as a definition of Swedishness, I think they would today. They had a person on their conference 2 conferences ago that actually said that they speak about how much humanity it is on a scale when you're human or when you're a Muslim, and no one in the room reacts to when he says this. He is afterwards expelled when it's a media problem, but their mindset is that this Swedishness is a core of their ideology, and that develops during the 90s and beginning of the 20s, and that is still the core. Then what have changed, which is important, is that they have tried to be a left party on social issues and a right party on economic issues. So, for example, they don't want to decrease unemployment pay. In the same way, they want to decrease taxes. So they try to be sort of both sides of the aisle.
They have grown in terms of vote share at every election that they've participated in since the 90s. This has happened at the same time that immigration to Sweden has increased in real terms, but also, you've alluded to this, that the background of the immigrants coming to Sweden has also changed. I think before 1980, virtually all immigration came from the Nordic countries, particularly Finland. But immigration from further afield, and especially from Muslim countries, has increased in certain. I think only 2% of Sweden's population was Muslim in 1990, and it's at least 7% now. You mentioned Islam a second ago. When the Sweden Democrats lament immigration, do they basically mean Muslims?
Yeah, historically, yes, they meant Muslim. And if you look at the immigration historically from Sweden to Sweden, you see different waves of immigration. From the beginning, it was people from Finland. In the 50s, it was people from Hungary. In the 70s, 80s, it was many people from Yugoslavia. We had an enormous immigration to our industries from former Eastern Europe, former Yugoslavia, and so on, which is something that we had basically until the beginning of the 90s. In the 90s, we have a large immigration from Bosnia. But the thing was that all these immigration waves were quite fast integrated in society. They got jobs, they got houses, and so on. So what the Sweden Democrats is targeting is not these groups. They are targeting people that are black, mainly from Somalia or the Horn of Africa that comes here, and they're targeting people that are Muslims and that want to practice Islam. So they target the symbols of these people, and they target these people, and it's very obviously racist from the beginning. It has no other connotation or anything. It's this Swedishness that they define these people not being a part of. You would, for example, not see the Sweden Democrats say this to Polish people or people from Yugoslavia, or definitely not from Nordic countries. That is not an issue for them. It's these people that are an issue. And it's very clear when they speak, what examples they use, that this is what's an issue.
Sweden Democrats first gained representation in Parliament in 2010. That's when Akesson first came into Parliament as well. What was their reception in Parliament when they got there? You mentioned that obviously this was the even before 2010, this was the first kind of considerable far-right movement that Sweden had had. How did people react when actually they got into Parliament?
Yeah, that also has a background story, and I have to give you the background story first. We had
please.
one right populist party that came into parliament before Sweden Democrats. You can't really say that they were a far right. You can say they're far right, but they're not the extremist party. They were a clearly populist party, and they came in 91 and was kicked out subsequently in 94. They were called New Democracy, and they sort of disintegrated within the parliament. So one of the things when Sweden Democrats built up their party was to not do as New Democracy, not be as New Democracy. So they have formed a kind of party discipline, formed a party structure, so they should not sort of repeat this failure of this previous party, which is quite a long time ago, but it's present in their minds, in the Sweden Democrats. So what they did in the parliament was to try to form this kind of a cadre party, which was very kind of introvert, but it was stable. It shouldn't disintegrate. It shouldn't sort of run all over the place. It should follow their leader and follow the principle of the Sweden Democratic program that they had. And all the other parties sort of put a kind of cordon sanitaire around the Sweden Democrats. They didn't cooperate. There was these incidents of people not wanting to speak with them, not to shake their hands in TV. Of course, they won tremendously much from this. when the Social Democratic Party leader, for example, did not shake the hand of Akesson in TV, it's not how you behave in Sweden. So it sort of created this kind of victimhood atmosphere, which they have used all the time. But basically,
presumably because it showed contempt not just for the Sweden Democrats in Parliament, but also the people that voted for them out in the streets of Malmö or Gothenburg.
To a certain extent, yes, but they didn't have too many voters at that time. But it's also, in Sweden, there is quite strict codes of how to behave. And what they did was that they created a situation where they broke just those codes that you didn't break. Like not shaking hands after something is extremely offensive. And the funny thing with this, they target very often this cultural or identity points, which is very, if you look at their election commercial, you have all like Midsummer, you have, I mean, all the jokes about how a Swedish person behaves on a Friday night. I mean, all these kind of things, all the national stereotypes, they are very good at using them and weaponizing them politically. And what they did with this victimhood thing in the beginning was clearly weaponizing the situation so that everyone that actually spoke against them showed contempt. It didn't matter what they said. We don't like your proposal. Oh, you show contempt for me. I mean, and they still continue like this. They have this tremendous victimhood feeling. And that was one thing when they started that the other parties couldn't handle.
Yeah, and you're showing contempt for Sweden, for our traditions.
Yeah, and now you show contempt. When I write about the Sweden Democrats in the paper, I always get mails with the text, you show contempt for 1 million voters. And this is the first line of defense. It's not like you have the wrong opinion or this is factually incorrect. It's you show contempt for 1 million people. Or now, when I criticize the government, I get the criticism, you show contempt for democracy. Because now they are one. Now they are above criticism. So this victimhood thing has sort of been with them all the way.
With the benefit of hindsight, the decade after 2010 was basically a march of the Sweden Democrats towards government. As you said, they're now in government. If you look at that,
they're not in government. They're in parliament, but supporting the government.
Right. Excuse me. If you look at that decade of the 2010s, what was the biggest single trend or event that provided a shot in the arm for that party?
I would say there is 3 crises that did that. It was the financial crisis or the euro crisis or whatever you want to call it for Sweden's part, most 2008, 2009. So the economy took a hit. It was the refugee crisis in 2014, but mostly 2015 when the borders basically broke down. And it was the Putin's war in Ukraine which raised the electricity prices and gas prices in Europe, electricity prices here, and sparked this cost of living crisis, which the government did not have the time to deal with and did not have the tools to deal with and was too late. And you can say that these three things combined give the Sweden Democrats a very good chance in this election. And it's interesting because the government today is the Conservatives, the Christian Democrats, and the Liberals. And the Conservatives and Christian Democrats actually lost quite badly in the election. The Liberals just scraped by with the support votes from other parties. And the Sweden Democrats are the big winner. And the Sweden Democrats is not in government. So these four parties, it's the way they stand now is the result very much of these three crises, you could say. And the funny thing at the crisis I'm not mentioning, which you probably notice, is the COVID crisis, because it's very fascinating that we had this Swedish Sonderweg, as the Germans say it, and they don't mean nice things with that, our special way of dealing with the COVID crisis. Everyone in Europe discussed the Swedish example, and it's not an issue in our election. And that's very fascinating. So that crisis did not really affect, but the other three did.
I want to focus on the second crisis that you mentioned for a second, which was the migrant crisis, mostly of 2015. Sweden took in 160,000 migrants, mostly in 2015. That was more per capita than any other country in the European Union. Bearing in mind that Sweden only had a population of nearly 10 million at the time, this was like 1.5% of your population in a matter of months. The equivalent in Britain would have been taking in about 1 million people in the same time frame, so like the population of Birmingham in one go. When you look back at the numbers coming in 2015, regardless of good intentions that the government and the Swedish people might have had in taking those people in, was this just too quick? Do you think you can adequately absorb those sorts of numbers in the time frame that we're talking?
If I'm allowed to contextualize that question a little bit, the year before we took, I think it was basically roughly the half of that. So if you look at this period, it's not 160,000. It's many more in a quite short period of time. I think that could have worked. In the beginning of the 90s, when we took the Bosnian refugees, it was also a huge number of refugees in a short span of time. About 100,000 of these refugees at the beginning of the 90s actually stayed in Sweden, which is not so much different figures from 160,000 with a larger population and 25 years on. So and that worked quite fine. You would not see any conflicts surrounding these people. They are integrated. They are part of the Swedish society. They are Swedes in all aspects of every way you can describe that. So that works fine. Why didn't it work so fine this time? I think there's a number of reasons. One is the increased racism in Swedish society. We had racism in the beginning of the 90s. Now it is worse, much worse, which the Sweden Democrats is an example of. We had houses in the beginning of the 90s. We had just had a big housing crisis. One of the things in this housing crisis was that the municipalities has built a lot of houses. So the Bosnian refugees, when they came, they had somewhere to stay. We also had a booming economy after this, so they got jobs. So what you see is, which we didn't really have this time. So you see the kind of material things was different. The political climate were different when these people came. And you can see the kind of last fight for this old Swedish migration model was actually a speech by the conservative leader at the time in the 2014 election, which was before the migrant crisis. But as I said, this started in Sweden before 1915. It started 1914, really. And they saw in their statistics 2014, sorry, their statistics that because of the crisis in Syria and because of this Western Balkan route, Sweden would have would take a number of more refugees than we ever had done in history for the coming months and years. He saw that in 2014. And he had a speech in Stockholm in the election campaign and say, open your hearts. That was his message to the Swedish people. That was the last pro-immigration speech on that level that anyone has really had in Sweden, on that level. In that year, the Social Democrats won the election. The year after, you had the refugee crisis, and the Social Democrats changed policy from this liberal migration policy. And they said that this is a temporary change. And now what we see is that it wasn't temporary, it's now permanent. And you can also see that now this government is strengthening and these restrictive parts of the policy. So you can say it peaked in 2014 in a way. But I think it could have worked if you would have better governance. It would have worked, probably. It worked in the 90s, so there is also a precedent for this. But now that time is gone, I would say.
I mean, I used the word adequately absorb these number of people, and I suppose it really depends on how you define the word adequately. Obviously, the people that now live in Sweden who came in from Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan or whichever other country, clearly their life is vastly improved than languishing in a refugee camp in Lebanon or Turkey. That kind of goes without saying. But they aren't without problems either. I mean, the unemployment rate among these people is very high. Many of them can't find jobs because obviously they've come to a country which has one of the best educated populations in the world. Self-employment is also very high, which is much more precarious. You know, and these circumstances have to some degree laid the foundation stones for things like what we saw earlier this year. Can you fill people in on what happened in Malmo and other cities in April of this year?
Depends on what you mean by happening. What it happened, lots of things. Which one of them do you mean? You mean Paludan or?
Yes.
The Quran burning, because
yes.
That is one story. The other story which happened in Malmö. When you say Malmö in Sweden, I would refer to shootings, gang shootings, gang violence, which is also happening. So that's why I'm asking, because there is not one.
Why don't we go through them?
We can go through the different crises because there is a number of them. The government didn't lose from one, the Social Democratic from one reason. But if you take Paludan, for example, that wasn't mostly in Malmö. The worst place was in Skäggetorp, which is mid-Sweden, you can say, and a number of places in mid-Sweden where Paludan had police. He got the police approval for burning the Quran during Ramadan outside mosques. That was his main idea. Then he didn't actually burn so many Qurans. He didn't actually have all these meetings. But that was his basic idea, to go around mosques burning the Quran. I'm not sure it should be wrapped in bacon or not, but that was one of the stories that sort of circle around this. He also have a party called Stram Kurs, which means like tight course or something. I don't know exactly. tight way. It's actually a Danish party, but he actually ran in the Swedish election with his party. So the burning of the Quran thing was an election stunt. More or less, and he did that quite effectively, I would say. He wanted to provoke riots. He did provoke riots in some places. Then the police started learning how to deal with both him and the protesters, and then most things went quite smoothly. But these Easter riots, as they're called here, which is funny because it was not because of Easter he did that, but never mind. He had this Easter riots. Had a profound psychological effect on the Swedish society, because these people that attacked him were criminals, and some of them have now been convicted for this. But they sort of used a tense political situation to attack the police. And when you ask the police, they say that this was not normal criminals. This was the same sort of gang violence leadership that the police have squeezed because of narcotics, because of rifle arms and so on. They took the chance within the framework of these riots to say that this was for Islam, this was for kind of a holy cause. This is actually only criminals. They should go to jail. That's it. But the thing was that because Paludan created this atmosphere of fear around these riots, he sort of provoked. He pushed like every button that you could on all sides of the political spectrum in Sweden. It pushed these radical Muslim groups, also Islamist groups. It pushed the organized criminality. It pushed the left to be sort of protesting against the police because of this. He pushed the far right to be protesting against immigrants. So it was sort of the whole spectrum was sort of activated by this. I was one of the person arguing that he should not have the right to burn the Quran outside these mosques. I made the proposal that he could burn the Quran in some wealthy neighborhood north of Stockholm, and then we could see if the right thought this was a great idea. The police didn't take my advice on that. But it was obvious that the reason he was allowed to create these situations that sparked the riots is also that this is parts of Sweden which has no voice in the public. He would never be allowed to do it in a wealthy villa suburb area anywhere. So this is in a way, it has many dimensions that this thing happened.
To bring the Sweden Democrats back into the picture, this polarization that you've just laid out was obviously brilliant for them politically. And it was at the election in September of this year, 6 weeks ago, that they had their best performance ever. And the Social Democrats, the centre-left ruling party, has now lost power. Can you go into the sort of changing of the guard that has happened in Sweden over the last couple of weeks?
Yeah, it's quite complicated because the previous government did not have a majority. And if you look at the historical division in Swedish politics, you have a left bloc led by the Social Democrats, you have a right bloc led by the Conservatives. That is the basic historical construction of Swedish politics. Then the parties within those blocks have sort of multiplied. So if you go back 50 years, it's 5 parties divided on these blocks. If you are now, it's 8 parties. But basically you have these 2 blocks still. That's the main structure of Swedish politics. And it differs 2 votes at this point. 2 votes in parliament, 2 mandates to the right wing at the moment. And in the last parliament, it was 1 vote to the left. So this is the kind of divisions you can see in this. But under the surface, it happens much more. And one of the things that happened under the surface is that the Swedish public have gone from being a center-left or a larger group that was center-left and center-right, to now stably have a larger group which is center-right than center-left. And this is a quite tremendously big change in Swedish politics. It's actually not completely new, but I would say that Sweden today is, in a way, a liberal conservative country. It's not a social democratic country anymore. It's something else. It hasn't really defined what that else is, but it's not the social democratic welfare state, which is the kind of core anymore. It is a voting bloc, which is more or less right-wing, which is the core of the electorate. So when you went into the election, it happened a few things which is important. One thing is that the Centre Party, which is historically a right-wing party, changed bloc because of the Sweden Democrats. They outspokenly said they will prefer Magdalena Andersson, the social democratic leader, as the prime minister. This meant that they lost a few votes, more in the countryside than in the cities. They won in the cities, to the liberals on the other side of the spectrum, which basically means that this middle of these 2 blocks is moving to the right. And that is, it sounds like a very strange explanation for the election, the votes moving between 2 liberal parties, but that is actually what decided the election. Then you can see within the blocks great movements. Within the left, you see that the Social Democrats win tremendously, which is very strange. Normally when you're in the government, you should lose, but the Social Democrats won. But the problem was they won from the left party, which is of course on the left bloc, and the center party, which is from the left bloc, which is completely useless in the election.
Because they weren't expanding their own...
Because they weren't expanding their electorate, they cannibalized on each other. So that's on the left side. On the right side, you see this tectonic shift where the Conservatives is not the largest party anymore.
Could you just take the microphone a couple of inches away from further away, if that's right? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's better. Cheers.
Yeah, and you can see this tectonic shift where the Conservatives is not the largest party anymore. The Sweden Democrats is by far the largest party on the right. And you see also that the Christian Democrats decreases their vote share. So on that side, you also see this cannibalism, but in favor of the Sweden Democrats. So in a way, we have now still these two blocks, but one block is led by the Social Democrats. I will say that it's a matter of time before the other block is led by the Sweden Democrats. So this is a very, very big underlying shift in Swedish politics. You see it in the election result. You don't see it in the makeup of the government yet. But it's very clear that Jimmie Akesson's vision is not being a support party for a conservative government, is being the leader of a Sweden Democrat government with the Conservatives supporting him. That's his idea.
So, if I'm right, the Sweden Democrats are essentially in a sort of confidence and supply deal with the right-wing bloc, which is the government, right?
Yeah, but I would say it's even deeper than that. I would say that they are a part of the government, but it's just that they have no ministers.
Technically, they aren't. Yeah, okay, right.
Technically, they aren't, but they have staff in the government offices, for example, and they have this program which says that you have an inner cabinet which decide the governmental affairs, and Jimmie Akesson is in the cabinet. So it's a kind of semi-government party, I would say.
So at future elections, then, do you think that the other right-wing parties have now basically dug their own grave because they've basically gotten rid of the cordon sanitaire that you spoke of earlier? It sort of exists in name only now, really. Do you think that at future elections, what we're seeing now really is kind of the tail wagging the dog, is what you would say in English? Do you think that eventually the Sweden Democrats are going to come to the fore properly, and it'll be Jimmie Akesson, not kind of kingmaker, but Jimmie Akesson, prime minister?
It could be. What is the arguments against that is that the Liberals can't really be part of such a coalition. They wouldn't survive an election with that kind of proposition. So you still lack a substantial amount of votes to secure a situation like this. But yes, I think that is quite possible. And I think that also the Conservatives and Christian Democrats have created a situation for themselves now, which is quite interesting, because they will take the burden of all the government decisions when we go into one of the worst crises Sweden has been through, which we will see the coming years. With the Sweden Democrats on their side, but where the Sweden Democrats don't need to take any responsibility for anything the government screws up. So the Sweden Democrats can be a kind of opposition against everything the government does. So I wouldn't be very surprised if the Sweden Democrats the next time will be even bigger, and the Conservatives and the Christian Democrats will be even smaller. But they have created the situation.
Yeah, they're in an ideal position at the moment.
They are in quite an ideal position, yeah, I admit that.
Something that was quite intriguing about the results that I saw was that in Britain and in America, we are used to young voters typically voting for left-wing parties. If I remember correctly, the young voted fairly heavily for the right-wing coalition, or more heavily than you might expect from a kind of Anglo perspective. How do you explain that?
That's because of TikTok. No, it's partly because of TikTok. TikTok here is heavily right or far right. No, it's different explanations. But if you look at the polls, if I remember just out of my head, I think it's 48% of the young people that voted either for the Conservatives or the Sweden Democrats. So yes, there is a tremendous big difference. It's a bigger difference when it comes to gender. I would say gender is the key differentiating factor. How do you vote? A young woman would vote for Magdalena Andersson, a young man for Jimmie Akesson. That is quite clear, typically, of course. But young people is heavily right wing. I think that it's many things. TikTok is partly true. TikTok and YouTube and Facebook and so on, because the right is dominating completely in social media here, which is partly due to smart strategies, partly due to the left being in government. And it's much easier when you're in opposition to be good in social media. It's quite hard to say the power, those in power are right, is not like a message very many people like in social media. So the role as opposition was very helpful for them. That's one thing. Second thing is that to be right or far right is trendy in Sweden. So you see a trend among young people where you also, in terms of lifestyle factors, is being more conservative. And that is quite interesting that you see this shift among young people, because Sweden has this tradition of an extreme liberal streak. And if you look at these kind of value surveys, we are the world's most individualistic country. We are the world's most freedom-loving country in the way that we don't accept the state regulations anywhere near things that are personal things. We don't accept that at all. We are extremely liberal when it comes to LGBTQ issues, equality, etc., etc. I mean, you have all these things, but they exist parallel. It's not a contradiction. It's not that young people are anti-gay or anything. They are pro LGBTQ rights at the same time as they think Sweden Democrats is a brilliant idea. So it's not an easy explanation for this shift. But as I said, in Sweden, everyone tends to do the same thing. If you go back to 1968, everyone did the opposite and was left. And now some people speak of the right wing's 1968, that's now. So we have this tendency of going to the extremes.
Funny, really. I mean, I also noticed that the old still vote very heavily for the Social Democrats. And I think if you divide sort of young voters by education level, you mentioned gender, but education level, this number of people who went to university who vote for Social Democrats is much higher, while the people who didn't typically vote Sweden Democrat or moderate. I was just wondering how much of this kind of rightward shift has to do with dissatisfaction over the welfare model. We spoke about the welfare model earlier. When I was in Sweden this summer, and I've spoken to Swedes for, going back for a few years, and they express very simplistic caricatures of what the welfare model is like, but they're always negative. And it's always something along the lines of people who go to university can slot into this very universal welfare model. They get brilliant benefits and insurance and time off. And if you exist in that system, well done you, you're doing really well. But if you're outside of it, you languish in unemployment or self-employment. That's probably quite simplistic. But if you look at the election results now, do you think that it shows a real dissatisfaction with the welfare model in your country?
No, I don't. And I think that every government who will try to touch the welfare model or the core of the welfare model, like health care, like schools, like care for the elderly, care for children, the basic unemployment system, basic health insurance system, and so on, they usually are kicked out by the voters quite fast. So no, I don't think so. I think that there is a kind of hate-love situation. On one side, you think the welfare model is not doing enough, and you have queues at intensive ICU. You have problems with schools not functioning. We have this market-based school system in Sweden, which is partly privatized and greatly favoring people with an educational background, or parents with an educational background, which people are very dissatisfied with. But if you would ask people if you want to give more money to schools or more money to healthcare, everyone wants to do that, even if it means paying higher taxes. So you have this hate and love situation. On one side, you think that the welfare states should give you a lot of things that you think you're entitled to, and it won't. So then you protest. On the other side, you want more of the welfare state. So this is part, I would say, of this social democratic legacy I spoke about in the beginning, that in our mind, the state is responsible to taking care of many, many more things than in most other European countries. And this is this unique Swedish combination of the kind of very individualistic tradition. You run your own life. No one should interfere on one side. On the other side, this welfare state as an enabler of that individualism. And scientists have called this state individualism as a concept, that we have this unique combination that we know that the state is there for us, therefore I can be free. But if the state actually have demands on me, I protest heavily, and I don't accept any demands on anything. And this combination is quite peculiar, but it's very, very visible in the Swedish political debate, if you look at what kind of proposals you can put forward. And it's been so for quite some time.
It may be noticeable. Is it sustainable, do you think?
I think it's quite sustainable, but it's an economic issue when you go into the crisis now, because the welfare state is not sustainable if you have 10% inflation and no tax increases. That's a non-starter. It won't work. And now we're going into a number of hard choices the coming years, because I mean in September we had, I think it was September last, inflation figures was 9.7% inflation. And of course, with 9.7% inflation, you won't have any money in local government or regional government for the services. And it came a report a couple of days ago from the Union of Swedish municipalities and regions, who said that they need about 20 billion Swedish kronas. I'm not really good at transferring it to pounds. But in terms of euro, that means 2,000 euro, basically. 2 billion euro, basically, which is a lot of money in Sweden. We're a small country. And just to maintain the present level of services in municipalities and regions. And the thing is that this new government has promised to lower taxes, so that they don't have any money. And this combination is unsolvable, I would say.
Well, we just found out in Britain that it's pretty unsolvable. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that you have sort of tried the same thing.
Yeah, I don't know how keen an eye the Swedes have been keeping on Liz Truss, but she's. I wouldn't be asking her for much advice if I were the new.
But I'm not really sure that the Swedish moderates will do the same thing. But it's the kind of dynamics by increasing costs and lowering incomes doesn't work for the state or for anyone else. And they will have this problem when they have the next state budget. And that is in November. That's like in 2 weeks.
Just as a final thing, immigration has sort of come up again and again through this conversation. If you add together the fairly odd interplay between a kind of rugged individualism that exists in Swedish society plus a welfare state, if you then add mass immigration into the mix, I was just interested to see, do you think that's how you explain what has happened at this last election, that it's not exactly the welfare model on its own or mass immigration on its own, it's kind of how the two interact with one another?
I'm not really sure if that is what interacts. I think the other thing I mentioned about crime has played a much more vital role in changing the perception of both the immigration issue, because what the right have succeeded to do is make crime an issue of immigration, and also the way crime now plays out in terms of shootings. We have basically had one shooting not every day, but I think it's at least it's more shootings now at this point than the whole previous year. And it's more deaths at this point than the whole previous year. So what we see is a spike in gang shootings and gang murders. And those groups that is dealing with this, of course, they're selling drugs, they're selling arms, they're doing a number of things, which is of course illegal. The police is putting more and more of them in prison, and it doesn't help. It comes new people into this systems, these gangs, these groups, and the violence just increases. And I think if there is one issue that this government lost the election, is this connection between immigration seen as some things that has to do with crime and violent crime, and then the violent crime spiking. And it actually spiked during the election campaign. So that is kind of a one thing, was the key issue. The other key issue was, of course, the prices of electricity, the prices, the cost of living crisis. So I don't think that the welfare state really is in the foreground of this election at all. If we would have discussed welfare issues, I think the Social Democrats would have won, actually. But since we didn't do that, it was very hard for them to win the election. In a long term, your question is of course very interesting, because can you combine a Swedish model with high trust, high welfare, with this individualism, with a pluralistic society? I would argue you can. We did that in the 70s, we did it in the 80s, we did it in the 90s. We were one of the last countries that actually have a far-right party in parliament at all. And now we're one of the last countries in the north that have a far-right party actually in a kind of similar situation in the government. So the unique thing in Sweden is not that we have the Sweden Democrat. The unique thing is it took so long time, if you compare with the other countries. So I would argue that it can work, but yeah, at the moment we have screwed up completely.
On a final note, if you look at the attitude towards immigration in Scandinavia more generally, the direction of travel seems to be more and more in the direction of restriction. And this isn't just coming from the right, incidentally. Denmark, I think, has a government which is led by the Social Democrats of Denmark, also centre-left, and I think they've imposed one of the strictest policies towards refugees in Europe. I mean, we hear a lot now about normalisation of the far right and normalisation of anti-immigration politics in Europe. Is this normalisation complete in Sweden now, do you think? Are we going to see the Social Democrats changing their policies more and more to fit with the kind of prevailing narrative about immigration?
Yes and no. Yes, the Social Democrats have already fitted into that. It was actually the Social Democrats who changed policy in 2015 to this more strict immigration policy. So yes, in a way. No, in another way. The Social Democrats will not accept the kind of framework that is now put up, where the conflict in society is between immigrants and Swedes. That is nothing one will accept. You will still have the idea of the welfare state with high taxes, with the general welfare, which is welfare for everyone in Sweden, and defending kind of human rights, defending the institutions of the liberal democracy. You will see the Social Democrats do all of these things. So you won't see a situation close to the Danish situation, I think, here, where everyone sort of accepts and it's a race to the bottom on all these areas. I don't think you will see that. But you will see a movement from the Social Democrats in this direction. And in the Social Democrats, there is forces that say that, okay, the Sweden Democrats have been right all the time. Why they have copied our policies, because that's where the Social Democrats' policies before the 90s. Okay, let's go back. That is a minority within the Social Democrats, but it exists, this kind of forces and discussions all the time. And the Social Democrats, it's a party of compromise. So you will end up something in between these policies.
Anders, thank you. I enjoyed that conversation. It was it's not an easy country to get your head around, especially when it seems to be throwing up election results that sort of go against the conventional wisdom about the country itself. So thank you very much for explaining a lot of that. If people want to keep an eye on Sweden and read your perspective on what's going on there, albeit obviously most of my listeners aren't Swedish, where can you send them?
No, I think that you should try to read. We have the Local, which is the paper about Sweden in English. And you can also follow the Swedish Radio International, which is in English. So that is 2 English-speaking channels. And then you can, of course, go to Google Translate and try to understand, for example, the editorial pages. I think the editorial pages, unfortunately, is quite kind of hard to translate with Google Translate. We're such a small language. But I would say that the Local is quite good in giving descriptions of the country, and also Radio Sweden is quite good in giving descriptions. And I think The Guardian, for example, I read The Guardian a lot. They cover Sweden quite well, which also BBC is covering Sweden quite well.
Thank you, Anders.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and, for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, so you never miss new content.